Hello and welcome to RUSI in London. My name is Neil Melvin and I'm the Director of International Security Studies. Today in our webinar, we're going to be exploring the evolving foreign policy of Pakistan at a key moment for the country. In today's webinar, what I'd like to just mention is that if you want to ask questions, and there'll be an opportunity after about 30 minutes, please use the Q&A button. When we look at Pakistan, the United Kingdom and other Western countries have had a long-standing relationship with the country, notably during the Cold War, a very positive one. And in the post-Cold War periods, there have been important areas of cooperation, but also areas of tension. The issue of Afghanistan has been a key one. And in recent years, we've seen shifts as Pakistan has sought to build a closer relationship to China and also to adjust to the evolving regional security politics around the Indo-Pacific region. Today, there's also issues about the relationship between the West and Pakistan over questions of religion, and of course, Pakistan's position in the United Nations. I'm delighted that our guest today is really one of the leading people to be able to speak about many of these issues. Ambassador Maleeha Lodhi is also very familiar to the British audience, having been High Commissioner in London, but also serving twice as ambassador to the United States, and most recently until October 2019 as Pakistan's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations, as well as a distinguished career in several other fields. And before we started, I was also hearing that Ambassador Lodhi is also devoting her skills and experience to the higher education sector. So we're really looking forward to a very interesting conversation with her. So welcome to the webinar, Ambassador Lodhi. Perhaps I could begin by asking you just to share your views as to where Pakistan is in this sort of broad landscape of issues, challenges, but also opportunities as we begin to see some changes in the region.
Melvin, it's a pleasure. I've been unmuted, I notice. I mean, one has to get into the technology before you start anything. But thank you so much, and thank you to RUSI for giving me this opportunity to speak. RUSI is no stranger. I wish I was there physically, but at least virtually, it's always an honor to speak to a distinguished audience, because I know RUSI always has a distinguished audience. So let me try to give you first, Melvin, an overview. Let me spend about 15, 17 minutes on giving you an overview, and then we can get into a discussion. So first of all, I think Pakistan's foreign policy outlook has to be seen in the context of the global environment and how the bigger geopolitical picture affects Pakistan's choices and, of course, influences regional dynamics. Three features of the global environment, I think, are noteworthy for the purposes of our discussion today. First, the obvious one, the unsettled phase the world is passing through, not just because of COVID-19, but also because of the fact that the international system is in flux. There are fundamental power shifts that have been in progress. Multilateralism is under unprecedented stress, and a rules-based international order has been increasingly fraying under the weight of so-called strongmen who have been acting unilaterally and in defiance of international law and norms. So Pakistan faces daunting foreign policy challenges at this time of global and regional strategic flux. The pandemic has injected greater volatility to an international landscape already afflicted by the erosion of multilateral cooperation, trade and tech wars between big powers, and attempts by regional powers to rewrite the rules of the game in their neighborhood. So I think navigating a world in such disarray, where unilateral actions, as I said before, and rejection of international norms by big powers and populist leaders have held sway, remains a challenge for the pursuit of Pakistan's foreign policy. But I think the one thing that one notices even, well, before the pandemic struck, is that in this environment, which of course precedes the pandemic, we witnessed that networks or ad hoc coalitions seem to be becoming the preferred mode of alignment by many countries, by most countries. So often single issue groups among like-minded countries are formed. And Pakistan too has been seeking to do this on different fronts and on different issues. So we're looking at a much more sort of open system where countries can ally or align with other countries on sets of issues. So you don't have to get into formal alliances on just about everything, which is often not even viable. But looking ahead, I think the post-COVID phase, if I can call it that, one has to be optimistic, will perhaps continue to see countries looking inwards and focusing more on themselves, at least for some time, as they deal with pressing domestic issues and managing the economic shock. And of course, the big issue of economic recovery. So that too will present a challenge. Now, the second global feature, or the second feature of the global landscape, is of course the advent of a Biden administration in the United States, and the question of what kind of departure it is likely to make in the conduct of US foreign policy. We know it will want to return to multilateralism and try to revive or rejoin the Iranian nuclear deal, which of course Pakistan will welcome. But on its topmost priority, relations with China, it is as yet unclear if the substance of its stance on China will be different than it was under President Donald Trump, beyond being less abrasive in form and in rhetoric. I think we see an anti-China public mood in the United States and congressional consensus for the administration to take a tough line on Beijing. So this may well influence the Biden administration's outlook, but as I said, we have to wait and see. I think the third feature I just want to flag is that the international environment is obviously being characterized by the resurgence of strategic tensions between the big powers, with, of course, the US-China standoff dominating the landscape. So the future course of the 21st century's most consequential bilateral relationship will have a truly global impact with direct implications for Pakistan's foreign policy. Turning now to specifics, there are at least 4 areas of immediate challenge for Pakistan. Let me quickly run through them. Firstly, navigating the Sino-US standoff, the obvious one. Second, as Melvin also mentioned, Afghanistan, as it moves into a phase of finding a negotiated end to the long war and to find ways of winning the peace. Third, relations, of course, with India and the dispute, the long-running dispute over occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The fourth area of challenge for Pakistan will also be the Middle East. The turmoil there, as well as Saudi-Iran tensions, will continue to pose challenges. So now let me turn to each and every one of these and describe some of the challenges and Pakistan's likely responses to these areas. As I said before, rising tensions between the US and China have a direct bearing on Pakistan. And even as Islamabad will not want this confrontation to affect its relations with either of the two countries, that is easier said than done, especially in view of Washington's strategy, as Islamabad views it, to parley India or project India as a strategic counterweight to China, and Prime Minister Modi's India prepared to side more openly with the United States. From Pakistan's perspective, this is unlikely to change under a Biden administration. So its longer-term implications will depend on how close this relationship becomes and the nature, of course, of the relationship. Because the consequences for Pakistan of the US-India entente are already evident by Washington's continuing augmentation of India's military and strategic capabilities. Thus, closer US-India relations in the defense and strategic realm, the economic realm does not have, obviously, that impact on Pakistan. But the relationship in the defense and strategic realm and the supply of high-tech equipment to India will confront Pakistan with a regional environment of greater strategic imbalance. Now, of course, Pakistan, as you know, has emerged as the pivot of China's Belt and Road Initiative, widely seen as the 21st century's most ambitious economic project. And this is driving the Chinese interest to strengthen Pakistan economically and strategically. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, what is known as CPEC, is acknowledgement and recognition of this and of China's interest in Pakistan's economic stability and in its economic progress. We have seen, or heard rather, criticism by American officials in the outgoing administration about CPEC. And this is seen by Islamabad as a rather unsubtle, though vain effort to drive a wedge between Pakistan and China. So while Islamabad will want to avoid getting in the crosshairs of US-China friction, it is obvious that Pakistan's strategic future, as it sees itself, lies with China. That is a strategic choice that Pakistan has made. So while our relations with China will be on a robust and positive trajectory, Pakistan does not have a zero-sum view of this relationship vis-a-vis ties with the West. Relations with the EU remain strong, and with the United Kingdom, historic ties have been strengthened in many new ways, to which I will return later. Ties with the United States, of course, witnessed an improvement in the last 2 years of the Trump administration, mostly owing to the Afghan issue. But imparting substantive content to the bilateral relationship is still a work in progress. While military-to-military links and CT cooperation continues, Pakistan nonetheless looks forward under a Biden administration to a more broad-based relationship that is not just about security, but also expands to trade and investment and greater people-to-people contact. President-elect Biden, of course, knows Pakistan exceedingly well. As someone has rightly said, no US president has assumed office having such intimate knowledge of Pakistan and having engaged with the country and its officials over many, many decades. He has visited, I myself had the privilege of working with him when he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And in that capacity, he visited my country several times. His last visit to Islamabad was, of course, as vice president. So Pakistan will want to build on this past relationship. It expects more stable ties and will offer cooperation on a host of multilateral issues where the two countries have shared interests. It will want Washington to have a more balanced policy approach towards South Asia, pointing to the negative, if not destabilizing effects of the lack of even-handedness if that becomes a policy approach to the region. I think it'll also, I'm sort of getting a little ahead of myself here, but I think Islamabad will also want to engage the incoming administration on help with finding a peaceful resolution of the issue of Kashmir, expecting also the Biden administration that is, likely to be strong on human rights to really speak out on the human rights violations in occupied Kashmir and to work with the international community to put an end to such egregious abuses there, which have been, of course, widely documented by international human rights organizations. So Islamabad will look forward to building a positive, strong relationship with the United States while understanding the limits of the relationship and the clear premise that Pakistan cannot and will not become part of any containment of China's strategy if such a strategy continues to be rolled out. Now turning to Afghanistan. In the near term, of course, Afghanistan will continue to be the principal commonality between Pakistan and the United States. So let me just deal with Afghanistan, on its own. I think the outlook there, unlike the outlook on Pakistan's eastern frontier, is hopeful and promising. As you know, the Doha Agreement has, between the United States and Taliban, which was forged in February, has opened up the prospect of a negotiated end to a war that has gone on for 20 years, if not longer, if you look at the civil strife and the civil wars that Afghanistan has been afflicted by. Pakistan, and I happened to be my country's ambassador in Washington at the time of 9/11. From the very beginning, Pakistan maintained that there is no military solution. There can be no military solution to this conflict. And therefore, it has welcomed the agreement of Doha and contributed in a positive way to the developments that led to this historic accord and to the start of intra-Afghan talks in September, this September, which is, as you know, aims to negotiate a ceasefire and determine the country's future. And this positive role that Pakistan has played has been acknowledged by American officials and the rest of the international communities. Now, only, I think, a day or two earlier, the talks in Doha between the Afghan parties have managed to reach an agreement on the rules and terms of reference or the procedures to govern substantive negotiations that lie ahead. This represents a very good beginning, but the path to a comprehensive settlement is not going to be easy. It never is after such a bitter, prolonged, and bloody conflict. But then the two Afghan sides are quite aware of the opportunity before them and of the Afghan people's yearning for peace and for stability. So hopefully, the parties know the stakes and they will therefore seize the moment. I think, Pakistan and all sides, Afghan sides in particular, of course, expect the talks to be long and arduous. And the main sticking points, not the only ones, but the main sticking points are going to be a ceasefire and some form of transitional arrangement to start with. The first being a priority for Kabul, and the second, which is the interim administration, being a priority for the Taliban. Now, I think when we look at what's been happening recently, the United States made an announcement that it would withdraw more troops ahead of schedule, which can be described as President Trump's last Afghan act, as it were. I mean, this raised the question in many quarters of whether this decision can lead to a disorderly exit and throw the peace process in jeopardy. My own view, and I believe that of Pakistani officials, is that this is unlikely to substantially affect the situation. Because in any case, the US drawdown was in progress. So troop numbers were going down anyway. So pulling out 2,000 ahead of schedule is not going to change very much, because the United States will retain its air capability and its CT capability. And while NATO-led forces of several thousand will continue their presence in Afghanistan until conditions allow. They will aim to leave only when conditions allow, and that remains to be determined what that actually means. So while Pakistan has repeatedly called for a responsible US troop pullout, officials really were neither surprised nor worried about the announcement of this accelerated pullout, and believed that this might even encourage Washington to step up and give more urgency to diplomatic efforts to goad the Afghan parties into hastening the substantive negotiations. Now, from our perspective, from Pakistan's perspective, the incoming Biden administration is not likely to change course. That's the view in Islamabad. Not likely to change course on the military drawdown, especially as this has gone so far ahead. Moreover, the president-elect himself has been, he has not favored continued military engagement in Afghanistan, has urged many a time an end to what he called forever wars. There is still some speculation that his administration might slow down the drawdown. That is a possibility. It might be done in deference to the views of NATO countries or to many defense officials of his own country. But again, that's not going to substantially change the on-ground situation in Afghanistan. I mean, the main question is how early and substantively the Biden administration focuses on the Afghan issue, given its very pressing and heavy domestic agenda and, of course, other foreign policy priority. Now, the key in Afghanistan itself to its future is whether the intra-Afghan dialogue can make progress towards a settlement, including a ceasefire, before all international forces leave and international or global interest begins to wane. Now, my view is that as a military option has in any case all but been exhausted, international leverage is likely going to shift from military to economic means. And this is indicated by the recent pledging conference for Afghanistan that took place in Geneva, where Melvin is sitting. This saw the US, the EU, and other donors commit around $3 billion for Afghanistan for next year and $12 billion over the next 4 years. But I think what was significant about these pledges was that they were conditioned on tangible progress in peace talks and a ceasefire. The EU said this, that it is conditioned, and so did the United States. For example, the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, said pretty directly, and I quote, "The choices made in peace negotiations will affect the size and scope of future international support and assistance," unquote. So I think this itself underlines that the international community's economic leverage will be more important in the months ahead and will become the principal means to influence the negotiating parties. But ultimately, it'll be up to the Afghan parties themselves. I mean, the international community, including Pakistan, can assist, but it's up to the Afghan parties to determine their own future and to make the tough compromises that will be needed to get to a settlement. Now, Pakistan, of course, has a vital stake in the success of the intra-Afghan talks that can end the war. Because for such a long time, turmoil, strife, conflict in Afghanistan has proved so destabilizing for the region, particularly Pakistan as a neighbor, and has left my country with a host of problems, including millions of refugees that we still host with meager resources. So I think, the incentive to do whatever Pakistan can to help this process is a very strong one. So while there is an opportunity there, there is also the danger that if an agreement is not reached between the Afghan parties, and as I said before, international forces leave the country, this could plunge Afghanistan into another phase of chaos and instability. It's a nightmare scenario for Pakistan, but one that it may also have to prepare itself for, while hoping, obviously, for the best and helping to realize the best. With that, let me turn to relations with India, and then I will say briefly a few words about the Middle East, and then we can get into the discussion. So relations with India, is the most vexed foreign policy issue for Pakistan. And these relations remain mired in a new cycle of tensions and hostility. Ties, in fact, plunged in the wake of India's abrogation of Article 370 of its constitution and its what Pakistan regards its illegal annexation of the state of Jammu and Kashmir in August 2019. And of course, subsequent developments. Now, subsequent developments saw a very, very harsh lockdown in Kashmir, a communications blackout, and continuing, if not more egregious, violations of human rights. And in fact, these violations prompted top UN officials and international human rights organizations to speak out and to urge India to act to stop these abuses. As of now, diplomatic engagement between Pakistan and India is pretty much confined to démarches that are made to each other. There's no dialogue. Dialogue has been since suspended for several years now. And the future remains fraught with uncertainty, and I think will, to some extent, be shaped by global geopolitics. Something I mentioned before, if the US continues its strategy of competition and containment of China, while projecting India as a counterweight to China, this will obviously have adverse implications for the region and for Pakistan. On the other hand, a more even-handed role in which the United States doesn't become a mediator, but helps to de-escalate tensions, would have a positive and stabilizing influence on the region. So, Pakistan faces its most imposing, its most formidable foreign policy challenge in the management of relations with India in the aftermath of, as I said before, Prime Minister Modi's repressive actions in Kashmir. Pakistan also regards aggressive moves by India on the line of control that divides Kashmir, and covert actions to promote subversion in Pakistan as representing a toxic mix of actions that have sent tension soaring to a record high. And they have ruled out any dialogue. Prime Minister Imran Khan has repeatedly warned about the danger of further military escalation. But what we see on the ground is no change. So the question then is, under what terms and circumstances can any meaningful dialogue resume between the two countries? That is the question that remains unanswered. And also, because until there is some kind of conversation about the real issues and efforts to settle outstanding disputes, sadly, the two nuclear neighbors will continue to be in an uneasy state of no war, no peace. Now, let me turn to the final section of my presentation, which is relations in the Middle East, where Pakistan has had deep and long-standing ties with the region, and it continues to be a region of high priority for Pakistan. Not only because Pakistan has a very large diaspora in Middle Eastern countries, but because it has had strategic ties with many Middle Eastern states. It has close strategic ties with Saudi Arabia. But despite this, it has tried to have a more balanced approach between Saudi Arabia and its neighbor Iran, the two countries remain locked in a tense standoff. So Pakistan will want to continue to stay the course on a policy that avoids being drawn into the rivalry, however challenging that might be. And that is why Pakistan avoided and said no to sending troops to Yemen, for example, when it was asked by Riyadh some years back. This is a difficult balancing act, but Pakistan's policy here is likely to continue in the same way. So before I conclude, a few thoughts on relations between Pakistan and the United Kingdom. Not much needs to be said because it's a good, strong relationship. The ties between our two countries are rooted deep in history, shared history. And of course, they're reinforced by the 1.6 million strong Pakistani diaspora in this country. So in addition to long-standing trade ties and traditionally strong military and CT cooperation, in recent months, years, we have witnessed stronger people-to-people links. And this is indicated by the royal visit last year, the increase more recently during the pandemic of British Airways flights to Pakistan, and the recent announcement, of course, of the cricket team's tour of the country. I think there's no better way of concluding a presentation to a British think tank than on the issue of cricket. You can't go wrong. So with that, Melvin, I hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We certainly appreciate the cricket reference. I think that'll always be something that, of course, that we hold very dear and in common. But perhaps I could just sort of go back to your opening comments, where you very well, I think, have described and tried to explain to us in the audience the complex and interlocked set of challenges that Pakistan has and that shapes its policy. You spoke about the world of instability and how Pakistan is trying to navigate that, but you're also quite clear that Pakistan has made a strategic choice towards China. So my first question is what is the nature of this strategic choice and how far do you envisage that choice going? Because I think over the last year, we've all witnessed quite a significant change in the international mood as regards to China. Many other countries, I think, have sought to try to balance between the United States and China and not commit one way or the other. But Pakistan seems to have made a strategic choice. It has a deep economic relationship. It has a developing military relationship to China. But there is also a set of countries now who I think are cooperating more and more around seeking to balance China. So where does that put Pakistan as regards those other countries? And I'll include the United Kingdom there. I mean, we've seen, I think, concern about Chinese behavior and what that means for the UK. Is the Chinese relationship now the leading relationship, a defining relationship that shapes Pakistan's positions towards all of its other neighbors? And perhaps a second question on that is, obviously this is linked into the question of India, as I think you highlighted in your, and the strategic choices that are available to Pakistan. If the Western community is looking to build this broader based relationship to Pakistan that you suggested might be a way forward, where would we need to look in terms of the Western relationship to India, and I suppose the difficult question of Kashmir, to build that broader relationship with Pakistan?
I think, let me respond, Melvin, to your first question, which I tried to partially address earlier. I think the strategic choice has been determined by Pakistan's view of its economic future. As we all know, without economic prosperity and growth, everything else is in vain. So therefore, China's interest, its Belt and Road project, Pakistan's relationship with China, this is not breaking news. Pakistan has always had a very strong relationship with China. In fact, Pakistan played, as you would remember, a historic role in during the Cold War in bringing the United States and China together. Henry Kissinger writes about it in his book. So, so Pakistan learned in the past to also play a role between the two countries. I'm not suggesting that we will do so in the future, but I'm saying this does provide a pathway for a relationship with both countries, which is not zero sum. But in terms of the relationship with China, it has been morphing over in recent years from a strategic defense-oriented relationship to a more economic trade and investment relationship. And that is a function really of the Chinese initiative that they've taken on Belt and Road. So, with CPEC becoming, being the very center of Pakistan's economic vision of its future, and this is a vision that coincides with the Chinese vision for the region. It is, to borrow the most commonly used Chinese expression, it's win-win, not just for the two countries, but we feel for all the countries that have signed up to CPEC. So, I would just conclude that part of my answer by saying Pakistan doesn't have a zero-sum view. Others may have a zero-sum view, which can pose problems, of course, and that's what you're pointing to. And then Pakistan would have to navigate very, very carefully. But as far as Pakistan is concerned, it does not see its relationship with another country to be at the expense of either China or our relationship with China to be at the expense of anyone else, especially since the stronger dimension of the relationship now is economic. So it really should not be seen as being aimed at anybody. As the Chinese themselves, President Xi said this all the while, that it's open to everyone to join CPEC, and if they don't want to, or not CPEC, but Belt and Road, and if they don't want to, then you come up with your own major economic, initiative. Now, the second question was about India, right? And how the West sees its relationship with India and how it impacts on Pakistan. Have I got that right?
Yes, well, if I understood from your comments correctly, so perhaps you could clarify this, the strategic choice, well, you framed it in positive terms around economic ones, but I also understood from your comments that the relationship with India and the growing closeness between the US and India was also framing the choice that Pakistan has made about its strategic relationship with China. So if on the Western side, we are looking to build a broader based relationship with Pakistan and address what I think must be some concerns about the Chinese-Pakistan relationship on the Western side. How can that issue of India-Pakistan relations best be managed going forward, accepting, of course, these very difficult and long-standing issues such as the Jammu-Kashmir one?
You see, at the moment, if I just address the India-Pakistan dynamic, of course, it has to be seen in the context of the bigger picture. But if you just look at India-Pakistan, Pakistan, I mean, there is no dialogue between the two countries. Pakistan did not suspend the dialogue. India did. However, the conditions to revive a dialogue simply do not exist. Left to themselves, the two countries seem to be unable to find a way to revive the dialogue, given the situation in Kashmir. And there's no change there. So I think there is a role there. I mean, I myself, when I was at the United Nations, I had several conversations with the UN Secretary General about this. And he kept saying to me, and I don't think I'm divulging anything because it's out there in the open. He kept saying, I wish I could play a role. I'd like very much to play a role in de-escalating these tensions and bringing the two countries to the negotiating table to resolve their differences. But I am bound by the fact that both countries have to accept my role. And of course, Pakistan was ready, able, and willing to accept that role, and India wasn't. So I think that's the problem right now. Pakistan needs a negotiating partner in South Asia. We would like to speak about some of these issues and try to resolve them. Address both issues that are of concern to India and address issues that are of concern to Pakistan. That's what negotiations are all about. I mean, they're not one-sided. Otherwise you wouldn't have two countries talking to each other. So I think, for us, that's extremely, I mean, we don't know. There is huge, as I said, huge uncertainty on that front. We simply don't know. We see a very aggressive, bellicose stance from Delhi at the moment. So, we wait and see if the Biden administration would at all be engaged in this to help the two countries at least start talking to each other. But on the basis of disputes, resolving disputes. I mean, talking just for the sake of talking also takes countries nowhere. I mean, we're not interested in form, we want substance.
Thank you. On a related issue, I think is the issue of human rights and Pakistan's position on particularly protecting and advocating for the human rights of Muslim communities around the world. We've seen this relationship, of course, becoming a difficult one with France most recently, and Pakistan, as you've highlighted, has taken a strong position on this as regards Jammu and Kashmir. But at the same time, we've seen recently comments by senior Pakistani officials denying that there are issues regarding the Uyghur population in China and seeking to downplay that. Whereas I think, we've also seen a lot of evidence pointing to a different conclusion. Do you feel that this trying to straddle this complex geopolitical line is damaging Pakistan's position on these questions internationally?
I think, first of all, Pakistan has always pursued a policy where we discuss human rights issues with countries, friendly countries, in private. So if there are concerns that we have, we convey them in private, in bilateral communication. So, I've heard this many a time that, there are double standards here and so on. No, I think it's how we conduct our foreign policy. And I think it's how China conducts its foreign policy. It does not publicly begin to make pronouncements. Look, no country's human rights record is perfect anywhere in the world. That's a fact. Some have more to resolve and address, and some have less. But there is no country. I mean, even if you look at a country that calls itself the most powerful country in the world, the United States, look what's been happening there. Look at the race issue there. So I don't want to distract from your question, which is a very valid one. But I do want to say that countries need to look at their own record and try to rectify it by all means. But Pakistan is not in the habit, and it's not given to making pronouncements publicly, and nor will I do so.
Okay, thank you. We're starting to get some questions now coming in, so in response to your comments. So perhaps I could turn to one of the questions and just expand it a little bit regards your comments about Pakistan's relationship to the Middle East. Mm-hmm. I think we've seen some interesting developments, sort of perhaps some shifts in Pakistan's positions as it starts to respond to these wider regional shifts. You highlighted the Saudi-Iran one. We've had a question about Pakistan's relationship to Israel, where of course we've seen some countries in the Gulf changing their relationship. But also the Pakistan-Turkey relationship has begun to emerge as a very close one. including even cooperating in other parts of the world. And we've seen that Turkey and Pakistan in the South Caucasus even have had some similar positions. Could you comment about the sort of the broader engagement of Pakistan across the Middle East and how that fits into some of the issues you're talking about?
Well, with Turkey, Pakistan, again, our relationship with Turkey has historical roots. There is shared religion, shared region, plus, even during the Cold War, we were in a Cold War alliance with Turkey. So, through different phases of global politics, the relationship with Turkey has always been a very close and a strong one. And it remains so. I think Prime Minister Imran Khan has been particularly interested in strengthening the economic dimension of this relationship. He's very strong on economic diplomacy, rightly so. So I think what we're seeing is, yes, our defense relationship has been there traditionally, but again, the vision is to try to steer the relationship also in a direction where there is greater trade and investment between our two countries. But of course, COVID-19 is in a way sort of frozen everything. And in a way, we have to wait and see once hopefully this pandemic is over, how we deal with but with the rest of, with the Gulf countries, close relationships. In many Gulf countries, Pakistan trained their, Air Force or their armed forces. So there's been a great deal of, the links have been very strong. The diaspora now also, it's a living bridge between many countries and Pakistan in the Middle East, the UAE. With Saudi Arabia, of course, a very special relationship. And as I said, Iran is a neighbor. And therefore, with Pakistan, which has contested borders, this is one border where we would like to see complete calm, tranquility, and stability. And I think only recently, the Iranian foreign minister was in Islamabad. And it's a testament to Pakistan trying to balance its relationships in the Middle East, even though the Middle East is, as you know, so polarized right now.
On that, I think the issue of the recognition of Israel.
I knew you would. I thought I was going to duck that one.
Would you like to answer that question?
Sure, with pleasure. There is no question of recognizing Israel, a usurper state, a state that continues its illegal settlements. It continues to repress the people of Palestine. It refuses to accept today a two-state solution, which is embodied in UN Security Council resolutions, not one, but several. So there is no question, given this, that Pakistan would move. Pakistan, is committed to the cause of Palestine. It believes that unless there is a two-state solution which sees an independent, contiguous Palestinian state emerge, there can be no question of the recognition of Israel. And I believe that countries, since I'm not an official, I can say so, I believe that countries that have done so have betrayed the Palestinians, and they've betrayed their own principles by doing what they've done. It's good not to be an official, you see.
I think that's...
You can at least say what's really in your heart and not just in your head.
And perhaps then I could also move on to, we're getting lots of questions on another issue, which I'm sure you faced before, and that is Pakistan's relationship to extremism, extremist violence, terrorist groups, and of course this question about the inclusion of Pakistan on the grey list of financing. How would you respond to those questions?
We've had these challenges, no question about it. We know where the challenges came from. We have been, in a way, at the center of the regional storm that has seen the emergence of militancy. We have unresolved disputes in our neighborhood. We've had a long war, conflict, strife, civil war in Afghanistan. We know where it all came from. But at the same time, Pakistan acknowledged the problem and began to address it. And I think we're at a much more comfortable place than we were, let's say, a decade ago. We have managed to defeat largely, I mean, there can be no 100% defeat, largely defeat the forces of militancy. We carried out we carried out the largest anti-terrorist operation anywhere in the world in our tribal areas. Largest, deploying thousands, tens of thousands of our forces. It was not an easy job. It wasn't easy to do. It took several years. So I think one can sort of argue convincingly that Pakistan has moved credibly to, one, acknowledge the problem and then address it. We still have miles to go. This is not a done deal yet. There are still forces that threaten society, the state. Pakistan has said repeatedly, we do not believe that anyone should use violence as a means to promote any political agenda, regardless of what that political agenda is, even if it's something regarded as legitimate, but the use of violence is not legitimate. So I think, as I said, it remains a work in progress, but compared to 10 years ago, look where we are. And it's acknowledged by the international community. As for FATF, we are working very hard to ensure that we address all the concerns that have been expressed. And I think we're moving in the right direction. And the member countries of FATF say so. That's exactly what they say.
Thank you very much. We've gotten some more questions about, I think, the position of different minorities inside Pakistan. I mean, I think we're perhaps moving slightly outside the foreign policy spectrum, but
Yes.
given that questions like the Baluch question does have an international dimension to it, and also some of the issues between Shia and Sunni communities inside Pakistan, how do you see that issue developing internally?
What you have asked is several questions in one. So it's hard for me to unpack all of it in one answer. But I can say, that Pakistan again recognizes that there are issues that it has to deal with in terms of disaffected minorities. And therefore, it has to respond, one, by ensuring that the fruits of economic development reach them, because that usually creates the kind of disaffection when people feel excluded. So, again, that is something that Pakistan has tried to address. As I said, we're not perfect any more than any other country is perfect in this regard. But I can say with total confidence that there is no issue today in terms of any province or any movement in the province that is challenging the writ of the state. There is no such thing. There are pockets of disaffection. And yes, there are minorities. We need to do a better job in terms of our treatment of religious minorities. And I think Prime Minister Imran Khan again has been very forward leaning on that count. He has himself done many things, which are symbolic, sort of, if you like, strong messages coming from the top leadership that we need to get this right. That, irrespective of your faith, you are a citizen of Pakistan and you must be treated as an equal citizen of Pakistan, which is what our constitution enjoins us to do.
Thank you. We have another, well, it's a partly international and partly domestic question, which is asked by Madeleine Moon about the climate change issue. And of course, Pakistan is suffering like many countries are. And there's also, I think, a particular issue around water and access to water, which is becoming acute in many areas. So perhaps I could ask you to comment on that, but particularly I think the issue of, in many issues, climate change is seen as an area where countries not only need to work together, but it can be decoupled sometimes from the more controversial aspects of relationships, and may even be an area where countries that don't agree sometimes can cooperate. Do you feel that could be an area for Pakistan to work with others on?
Oh, absolutely. I think Pakistan was a very early supporter of the Paris Agreement on climate change. We played a very active role. I happened to be at the UN at that time. And the signing of the agreement itself, I was physically present in the UN General Assembly. So I can tell you that my country, which is one of the worst afflicted in terms of climate change, but a country that has contributed minuscule to the problem, to the emissions that have created this big problem. We know what we need to do. And I think, again, Prime Minister Imran Khan has used a nature-based solution to address some of the challenges of climate change. For example, his billion tree tsunami, as he calls it, which is planting 1 billion trees to help address this issue. But we also have, melting of the glaciers. Pakistan is a very diverse country. We have deserts, we have, glaciers, we have peaks. So, we have been affected very badly, and water scarcity has been, as you rightly identified, Melvin, part of the problem. But again, I would say that, climate change, yes, we hope that the Biden administration will return to the Paris Agreement. We think that will open up uh, a second phase, as it were, of implementation of this agreement globally, and also release funds, because many developing countries need funds to do some of the mitigation of climate change. But as far as Pakistan is concerned, the United Nations has, in fact, if I remember correctly, I don't remember the exact words they used, but they, very much acknowledged and praised Pakistan's, uh, billion tree tsunami for this reason, that Pakistan was one of the leaders in policies to mitigate climate change.
Thank you. We've got another question, and I think it really goes back to your initial comments, which is about how Pakistan is fitting into these big global trends. And so we have a question which is from Asma Bilal about how Pakistan is looking towards the concepts of Eurasia. We also, of course, have this concept of the Indo-Pacific, which is increasingly taking shape around the United States, Australia, Japan, India, and others. Eurasia, of course, is very much a Russian concept, and Pakistan there's been reports that Pakistan and Russia's relations are becoming much closer. Does Pakistan have a particular view on all these big geopolitical concepts? Does it feel that it's part of one more than others? Are they useful in thinking about some of the trends that we see today?
Well, I think, Melvin, some of these big, blocks, if you like, that you have mentioned, so long as they promote economic aims and economic development, trade, investment, Pakistan can have no issue with them. Pakistan would support them. But they should not be means to project any kind of a containment of China policy. If they have an underlying or a disguised geopolitical aim, then the bloc or the alliance or whatever you want to call it is likely to face problems, because it will not be seen in terms of its stated purposes, but it will be seen as a way to encircle China. Pakistan is a great believer that there should be détente. There should be a good relationship between the United States and China. That would be helpful for everyone in the world. Tense relations between the two countries adversely affect the whole world. They have a global impact, truly. So I think on that count, I would say that, Pakistan, more, but we do believe that some of these groupings must be organic. They must emerge from the region themselves, because that's when people have a real buy-in. When they're imposed from outside by extraterritorial powers, then they often have geopolitical objectives. And therefore, they have a certain trajectory which doesn't often lead to, let's say, success. Now, I think for Pakistan, I'll just take your question to a slightly different direction, but related to it. The prospect of peace in Afghanistan, for example, opens up huge and promising opportunities for regional connectivity. And there are several projects involving Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran sometimes not, and Central Asia. So, these are huge multinational projects that are waiting to be realized, but all of them, in a way, they just are frozen because of the lack of peace in Afghanistan. So there's CASA 1000, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative also, the extension of that into many of these countries to create the regional connectivity. So, my personal view would be, the more the merrier. I mean, that's fine. If countries wish to become partners in multiple such arrangements, because it is to their benefit, the benefit of the economic benefit of the people and the economic welfare of the region, so be it. I think we would welcome that.
Unfortunately, our time is running out, but perhaps I could ask you just one final question, which is, I think you spoke in very warm terms about the relationship between the United Kingdom and Pakistan, and of course, there are very sort of firm foundations in terms of, well, sporting relations that you spoke about. Of course, there are very many human level family contacts between the two countries. But the geopolitics is also starting to shape the UK's perspective on the region. The Prime Minister has been invited to India next year. And of course, the UK is looking at the Indo-Pacific as a strategic space. Are you concerned about how the Pakistan-India sort of British bilateral relationship may be shaped by those trends? And where do you think the issues of tension might emerge around those questions?
I think, to answer that very honestly, trying to be honest throughout, it's not on just this question. Pakistan doesn't have a zero-sum view. It's not as if you have a relationship with India, that's to Pakistan's detriment. No, that's not true. However, there is a however. If that relationship acquires a strategic dimension where high-tech equipment, military supplies, and so on, is provided to one country in a region where two nuclear neighbors are still locked in a tense standoff, then, its destabilizing effect is before you. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that that kind of augmentation of India's military and strategic arsenal is not going to be helpful unless, of course, the two countries are talking to each other, they're resolving their issues, and they're no longer disputes. So I think we return to the need and the urgency for countries to step up and see how they can help in de-escalating tensions between the two countries and ensuring that the dividends of peace are available to the people of South Asia. Why should they be deprived? They're deprived because, there are unsettled, unresolved disputes which have to be settled, surely. So I would say, the worry would only be on one dimension of the relationship, not on the relationship itself. I mean, look, it's every country's sovereign right to have a relationship with whichever country it wants, or to enter any grouping or block of states for whatever purpose. But if the fallout on another country is an adverse one, that country is going to talk about it. And that's basically what I was pointing to.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Lodhi. We really appreciate, I think, your honest and clear answers. I think you've really helped us to understand the fascinating but also very complicated situation that Pakistan finds itself in. We at RUSI, of course, really appreciate the opportunity to learn your views and to engage with Pakistan on these questions. We've now established an Indo-Pacific program, which is trying to study some of these broader questions, and we look forward to returning to this issue of the challenges of South Asia, but also how South Asia and Pakistan fits into this particular set of issues. But for today, I'd just like to thank you for your comments and for joining us. And I look forward to the next opportunity to meet you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to RUSI for